Best of luck getting that invite out.
Thanks. Bye.
Hey folks, we're working through a bit of some technical issues. As you may have noticed, we just resent the meeting invitation with the updated meeting number for today's meeting and link. And so we appreciate your patience as we get as many people the updated information as quickly as possible. As a reminder, please mute your phones if you're not speaking as we work to get everyone on the call. Thanks. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon at this point, as we work to get as many people the new conference call line information as possible. We're probably having a slight delay in getting started for this meeting.
Hey, Sergio, it's Lynn. I just called in.
Hi, Lynn.
So
Lynn, did you say anything, or so it's just that you were calling in?
Just that I was calling in so you can see which number I am. I'm going to send it. I know the phone number. Okay, yep. Make sure that people ask for it after the fact. Oh, boy.
Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. It's 12:02. We have about actually 36 individuals calling in. Our apologies for the mix-up this morning with the meeting number for today's meeting. We're trying to punch that out to as many people, any members and alternates as possible, as quickly as possible. So we appreciate your patience as we get everyone logged into today's meeting. As a reminder, please look to mute your phones if you're not speaking to reduce background noise. Appreciate it.
I don't know why my email for Kelly isn't saved.
Good afternoon, everyone. We have about 40 individuals on today's WebEx meeting for the May Transportation Planning Board. Apologies for the miscommunication with the meeting number and link for today's meeting. We're working to punch that out to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, members and alternates. And once the chair joins us, we'll look to figure out at what time we should get started. Until then, thank you for your patience, and please mute yourselves if you're not speaking to reduce background noise. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for the delay in starting this meeting. We have about 50 people on the call. Thank you, Russell, and my apologies for the technical difficulties this morning. We have about 50 individuals. We have 50 individuals on the call right now. We've been punching out the new information as many people as quickly as possible. It looks like we're doing a pretty good job. This is about the same number we've had in previous meetings. But we'll certainly continue to push that out for the next about 15, 30 minutes, just to ensure if any individuals might have not received it quite yet. For the participants on the call, thank you for your patience. Please, as a quick reminder, mute your lines if you're not speaking to reduce background noise. Chairwoman, I'll leave it to you to figure out how long we want to wait to go ahead and get the meeting started. We have about 53 individuals now on the call. I suspect we could give them a few more minutes before we officially start.
Okay, well, and I apologize. My first purchase when this is all over is a brand new computer because I have an awfully slow one.
Yeah, me too.
Could we confirm that everyone's unmuted and that to be muted, you need to mute it on your device? Is that where we are today?
Yes, I do not mute anyone unless that individual is being very disruptive to background noise, feedback that can disturb the individual. So I do not mute unless I leave it up to you all to mute.
Thanks. I promise not to be more disruptive than usual. Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, we're about 8 minutes after, so I think we'll go ahead and get started and call this virtual meeting to order. This is Kelly Russell, your chair of the Transportation Planning Board. Just wanted to point out that I am sporting today the Springy Visualize 2045 green t-shirt to set the tone. I hope you and your families and loved ones are staying safe and well. I believe all of us have gotten pretty used to participating in virtual meetings, and now we're pretty used to having some glitches every once in a while. Please do keep the email you just received from Conti handy for useful information on participating in the meeting, and importantly, the process in case any technical disruptions. So we're going to follow the same process that has served us very well for the past 2 meetings. Here's a recap of the process that I'll be following. First, I'm going to ask Lynn to take a roll call of members or alternates to document your presence at the meeting. Second, in the interest of time, we're going to forego the staff presentations again on a couple of items for which written reports have been provided in our read-ahead packet. And these would be the report of the Technical Committee, the Steering Committee, and the Citizens Advisory Committee. During those items, I will, however, ask members if they have any questions for staff, and I will invite those questions by jurisdiction. There are no action items today other than accepting the minutes. So just again, a friendly reminder to please state your name and your jurisdiction whenever you speak, and please remember to mute your mic when you are not speaking. So we'll start with Lynn and the roll call to confirm we have a quorum. Lynn?
Great, thank you, Kelly. So I'm going to start through like I've done the last couple of times and identify the jurisdiction, and if you could please state if you're present or not. I'm going to go through the list top to bottom. So starting with the District of Columbia, DC Council Phil Mendelson.
So now is that we really need to individualize our
DC Council Charles.
Sorry, Len, this is Charles Allen. I think I heard you ask if I was here.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Lynn, just briefly, Phil Mendelson had texted me. He's actually trying to call in right now, so he should be joining shortly.
I just called in. I take it there's no WebEx?
Mr. Mendelson, there is a WebEx.
Brand new email.
We'll send that to you.
Yes, so there is definitely WebEx and a phone number that we've had to make a last minute change. So apologies. Continue with roll call. DC Council Brandon Todd.
This is Sam Stevens, his alternative.
Thank you. DC Department of Transportation.
This is Jim Sebastian.
Hi, Jim. DC Office of Plan.
This is Kristen Calkins, and alternate to Andrew Tublood.
Thank you, Kristen. Maryland, the City of Bowie. Charles County. College Park. Frederick. City of Frederick. Kelly Russell.
Kelly Russell here.
Thank you. Also, I'm going to interrupt by saying if I just shoot me an email, we will capture you, and I will also inform the chair that you're participating. Okay, City of Gaithersburg.
Neil Harris is here. Hi.
Hi, Neil.
Good morning, Emmett Jordan here.
Hi, Emmett. City of Laurel. Montgomery County Council.
Evan Glass is here.
Hello. Montgomery County Executive. Prince George's County.
Vic Weisberg.
Vic. Vic's actually Prince George's County Executive. Any representatives from Prince George's County Council? Ms. Tavares or Ms. Claros? Okay. City of Rockville.
Bridget Newton's here.
City of Tacoma Park.
Hi, Casey Kostick.
Hello. Maryland Department of Transportation.
Earl Lewis here.
Earl. Maryland House of Representatives.
Corman.
And our last in Maryland is Maryland Senate, and that's a vacancy. So we are going to move on to Virginia.
Hey, Lynn, sorry, I was on mute before. Jason Groth, Charles County is present.
Hi, Jason. Thank you.
Thanks.
Did I miss anyone in Maryland? Anyone else? Okay, thanks. Moving on to Virginia, the city of Alabama.
This is Kenneth Aguirre.
Hello. Arlington County. Yeah, I've got
Christian Dorsey is present.
I'm sorry, Arlington County again?
Christian Dorsey is present.
City of Fairfax. Fairfax County.
Rodney Lusk, present.
Thank you, Mr. Lusk. Anyone else from Fairfax County?
Lynn, this is Sergio. I just spoke with Mr. Walkinshaw and sent the information to him and Mr. Alcorn. So they should be signing in quick soon.
Okay, great. Thank you, sir. Okay, we're not. City of Falls.
Hi, Dave Snyder. Thank you. Present.
Thank you. Fauquier County. Loudoun County.
This is Matt Letourneau.
Thank you. What else from Loudoun County?
Bob Brown, alternate.
Thanks, Bob. City of Manassas.
Pam Sabeski's here.
Hello.
Hello, everybody.
City of Manassas Park.
Jeanette Russell is here.
Michelle. Prince William County.
Wheeler here.
Hello.
Angry here.
Okay. Okay. Virginia Department of Transportation.
Renee Hamilton is here. I'm sorry, has Prince George's County been called?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that.
Did somebody call for Prince George's County?
Oh, yes, Prince George's County. Yes. We have Vic Weisberg is council here.
The county council member Denny Tavares is present.
Thank you. Gotcha. Okay. Virginia Department of Transportation.
Renee Hamilton is here.
Thanks, Renee. And then we have vacancies for the Virginia House and Virginia Senate. So we'll move on to WMATA.
This is Sham Khan, present.
Sham. And now our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration. Federal Administration. National Capital Parks, or National Capital Planning Commission.
Julia Coster is here.
Hi, Julia. Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority. And lastly, National Park Service.
Tammy Stidham is here.
Hi, Tammy.
Hi, Lynn, it's Sergio.
Yes.
I just sent the information to Ms. Jackson.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that concludes our roll call. Again, if I've missed you, please email us and email me and Sergio, and we will make sure that you're captured. Madam Chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I do believe we have received some public comment for today's meeting. Do you have that email, Lynn? Could you read it for us?
I do, and I will. Thank you. So this is email from Kalai Kadaswamy, and and just like the same person that's commented recently. So I'm going to read his comment. So requests to include slug pickup locations to the Commuter Connections website, outreach and promotional materials, and TPB's Visualize 2045. As all transportation systems in DMV, Slug Lines also lost its ridership, but it did not lose any money. Slugging is a volunteer-run system that has a ridership is about 20,000 per day. That is similar to VRE ridership, which is 19,000 trips per day in 2019. Slug Lines reduces about 6,500 vehicles going to Arlington and DC every day. Slug Lines also saves about $2,500 per year for each rider and a lot more for drivers in tolls on I-95, I-395 express lanes if they drive alone. Unlike traditional carpooling with fixed commuters, fixed pickup time and location, slugging brings the flexibility to drive or ride anytime and reduces single occupancy vehicles. Aggregation and dynamic matching help commuters save time and commute expenses. In 2018, Arlington Transportation Partners conducted a commuter race from Herndon to Roslyn. Slugging was in the third place with the shortest commute time after driving alone on I-66 express lanes and telework. Driving alone came in first place, but came with a high cost. This provides insight into time and cost for each mode of transportation. Slugging is not the traditional carpool. It requires infrastructure like a bus stop, where about 5 to 7 vehicles can pull up to the curb site and safely load riders. I would greatly appreciate if the region authorities recognize the most flexible, fast, and free mode of transportation system and provide proper infrastructure like the one at the Pentagon. I want to close out by saying we need all modes of transportation in the DMV. We did a survey last week to assess the impact on slugging due to this pandemic. 50% of slugs said it doesn't affect them, 30% said less likely, and rest, 20%, may not slug or work from home. Slugging is just not a transportation system, it is a community building tool. Commuters do not see color, race, or gender. We help each other every day for a fast, flexible, fair, and toll-free commute. Hope you all recognize, include, and promote Slug Lines. Stay healthy. Thanks, Kalai Kadaswamy. That concludes our comments today. Ms. Russell.
Thank you very much, Lynn. We're on to the approval of the April 15th, 2020 meeting minutes. I'll take a motion to adopt the minutes, and when you make the motion, please again state your name and jurisdiction when you make the motion.
Hey, this is Charles Allen. I'll move.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Is there a second?
Emmett Jordan from Greenbelt, seconds.
Mr. Jordan, thank you very much. I'm going to, again, only ask for nays or abstentions by jurisdiction. If you do not respond with a nay or an abstention, it will be considered a yes vote. Any abstentions or nays from the District of Columbia? From Maryland? From Virginia? From WMATA or other federal agencies?
Yeah, sorry, Madam Chair. This is Supervisor Letourneau from Loudoun County. I will abstain.
Thank you, Mr. Letourneau. Any abstentions or nays from WMATA or other federal agencies? The motion carries with one abstention. You have all that for the record, Lynn?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, on to the technical committee report, and we're almost back on schedule. Again, we're going to forego the summary and just ask if there are any questions for staff on the meeting summary that was included in our read-ahead packet. Great. Hearing none, we'll move on to the Citizens Advisory Committee report and Access for All Advisory report. Are there any questions for staff on the Citizens Advisory Committee meeting summary that was included in our read ahead packet? Okay, now I am going to invite our colleague Casey Kostick to brief us about the Access for All Advisory Committee. They have not met formally, but they have been communicating. So thank you, Casey. Are there any questions for Casey or staff on the activities of the Access for All Advisory Committee?
This is Casey. Yeah, is it all right if I walk through, Madam Chair, some of the comments we
Absolutely.
received?
I missed my cue there, and the pause for you to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. So the Access for All Committee, as Ms. Russell said, it has not met this month. We postponed our meeting until next month, but we did ask the members to report out on some of the challenges that they've been seeing for their staff and the people that they serve in their organizations. And we heard back some really useful information. So I wanted to just take a couple minutes to walk through that. I'm just going to share by person who sent this information. So the first one was from AFA Marmar Nehama, who is representing So Others Might Eat, which, as many of you may know, fights poverty and homelessness. And she reported that both their staff and their clients are having a lot of challenges related to use of public transportation. She said staff in particular are really struggling. They're experiencing it to be unreliable and having safety concerns and changes in routes, which is making it hard for staff and clients to get to their places of employment. She noted that there were challenges because of the changes and routes that are not running, particularly for Metro Bus and to some extent for Metro Rail. For their clients, she noted that clients are having a hard time getting to medical appointments, to the clinic, as well as residential clients having a hard time getting to appointments or feeling safe in doing so. And she also noted that it's also been harder for clients to get taxis and Ubers than in previous times before the pandemic. And then she additionally added that people are feeling unsafe to travel, and they're finding that some people are avoiding going to the hospital or having their chronic care appointments, which is making them more sick because they simply don't want to travel or go to those places. We also heard from Andy Wexler from Arlington, the STAR program, which is their paratransit program. The ridership is down considerably as a result of COVID-19. He noted that normally they have about 100 riders on weekdays, and right now they have 50 to 60. Both of their contracted service providers are taking extensive measures to keep the vehicles clean and sanitary, but they're also seeing a number of their independent drivers who have stopped driving due to safety concerns, which has been causing some occasional shortages for availability of vehicles to their clients. Sorry. Karen Smith from the Arc of Prince William reported that all of their day services are continuing to be closed and the residential programs are in stay in place. And they have had no transportation services that have been utilized since mid-March, except for necessary medical appointments. Sarah Fott from the Jewish Council for the Aging noted that COVID-19 has changed how their community partners are providing service to seniors and how their Village Rides and NV Rides programs are supporting their partners. Similar to what some of the others have said, they have shifted to only providing rides for medical appointments. And a number of their riders, as well as their drivers, many of whom are seniors themselves, have opted to stay home, which has reduced the number of rides that they're able to provide. And a lot of their partners have pivoted to fill different needs, replacing driving people to appointments with delivery of groceries and other supplies, as well as friendly calls. Then I also have a report from Sherry at IT Curves, which is a taxi industry platform. She noted that their impact is with petitioning municipalities to make them aware of funding for transportation for the transportation disadvantaged, and that funding can be used towards delivery and pickup to give equitability to the transportation disadvantaged. And she noted that this platform is currently used with unscheduled demand transportation prime contractors with Metro. And then TPB staff member Lynn Wenchel-Mendy put together some very useful tidbits about what she's seeing. And some of those include seeing adaptations in transportation services, as I mentioned, to shift from delivery of groceries, or shift from what they've traditionally been doing to delivery of groceries, prescriptions, and meals for at-risk populations, rides for essential workers, and then volunteer drivers shifting to other activities from what they might normally be doing. She also noted that the CARES Act tends to be transit focused and does not, and through the 5311 and 5307 programs, some benefit to independent contractors in the taxi industry, includes drivers for some of the subrecipients operating wheelchair accessible taxis, but some have run out of money. For 5310 enhanced mobility, that is not part of the CARES Act, and there's been no FTA guidance at this time regarding 5310. Programs with an outreach or training component have been impacted and are moving to online or training or outreach. And programs that usually transport people with disabilities to employment, training, or adult day programming are focusing on participants in community-based group homes to ensure necessary food, medicine, supplies, and medical appointments. And that's all I have for now. I'm happy to answer questions or to follow up and get more information if people have questions about any of these items.
Casey, thank you for sharing that really valuable information. People are really struggling with this across the board, so it's good to hear what we need to hear so we can work on those issues. Are there any questions for Casey or staff on the activities? We'll start with this. I'm going to do it by jurisdiction. So I'm going to start with questions from the District of Columbia. Questions from Maryland. Questions from Virginia.
Question.
Yes, ma'am. And identify yourself, please.
Loudoun County, Kristen Umstadt. Thank you. Is TPB doing outreach to all entities that might provide transportation, or are we soliciting input? How are we getting that input? Are they volunteering, or are we reaching out to them?
In this case, we reached out specifically to the Access for All committee members and asked them for information since we didn't have our meeting, and we felt like it was important to get that information to share with the board. Conti, is there other outreach that's being done?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question, Constance. Through the Enhanced Mobility Grant Program, where we do provide FTA funding for these nonprofit organizations that are providing these services, we do have their contact list. We are reaching out to them to see what situation they're in and get some information from them, particularly since this issue has been brought to our attention that CARES Act did not include some of those other programs. And there is now talk about and quite a bit of outreach to the congressional delegation on a CARES Act too. So we are reaching out to them as well.
Thank you very much, Conti.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from Virginia? How about WMATA or the other federal agencies? And one last call for questions on the Access for All from anybody. Great. Casey, thank you so much. Thanks to your members who continue to be diligent during this crazy time. Thanks. So we're on to the steering committee actions and report of the director. Are there any questions for Conti on the items that are included in the memo? Anybody? Okay, I did want to highlight that in your packet is a copy of the TPB's letter to the region's congressional delegation, informing them about the need for special funding for local and state governments to help them offset anticipated reduction in local and state transportation funds from the slowdown in economic activity during this COVID-19 pandemic. I will note that many national organizations have since sent similar letters, including one from the COG Board of Directors. This matter that the board discussed during our April 15th meeting cannot be overlooked or understated. The economy has taken a significant hit, and along with it, funding for transportation. I'm sure that most of you will agree with me that it will be a while before the economy recovers fully, and transportation funding is restored to previous levels. The transportation system is critical for the economic activity, and we need to be sure that they have the resources needed to keep it safe and operating. So I just want to say thank you for that suggestion last month, and it was a great letter prepared by staff. I will move on to chairman's remarks, which are none other than, again, I'm sporting the Visualize 2045 green t-shirt today. And we're going to move on to we have 3 exciting informational items today. We're going to start with the safety study deeper dive data analysis with John Sherman. We're going to continue our examination of roadway safety as we move towards a set of recommendations that this region can take to improve safety of our roadway users. During last month's briefing on this region's fatal and serious injury crashes, we learned that fatalities involving pedestrians, crashes at or near intersections, and crashes along principal arterials are rather high. Today, John's going to share the findings of an in-depth analysis of the data on these 3 types of crashes. I will note that next month we'll be receiving a set of recommendations compiled from the study we commissioned. Discussions held with Transportation Department safety engineers, our safety committee members, and other stakeholders. The recommendations would be actions that we as members can take individually within our jurisdictions and collectively as a region. So John, we'll go ahead and you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Russell and members of the board. Last month, I shared with you the initial results of the consultants team's analysis of our region's crash data. The consultant team has completed additional analysis that delves deeper into pedestrian crashes, crashes at intersections, and crashes along major arterials. There's a brief memo in your mail-out package that provides some additional context and schedule for future briefings, which the chair has already mentioned. Before getting started, I want to let you know that I have added some slides to this presentation that were not there in the original mail-out. 3 of these newly added slides are carryovers from last month's presentation and help explain why we decided to do a deeper dive into pedestrian intersection and major arterial crashes. There's 3 other new slides that put down in writing, so to speak, the relevance of these analyses, what they mean for the work that we're currently doing to develop a set of recommendations for you to consider at next month's meeting. And once again, you will be seeing a lot of charts, graphs of fatalities and serious injuries. And I ask you to keep in mind that each of these numbers is a tragedy to the residents and visitors of our region and their loved ones. Next slide, please. So the main topics for today are the results of the deeper dive analyses into pedestrian intersection and major arterial crashes. This slide on crash types and the 2 following slides, which I shared last month, show why we selected these areas for a deeper dive. And here these crash types are organized into 3 categories. We have non-motorist, lane departure, and intersection/access management crashes. So if you look at the fatality bars, which are in orange first, the pedestrian crashes are at the top of the list. And this clearly supports taking a deeper look into pedestrian crashes. And also note the large numbers of serious injuries and fatalities associated with left turn angle crashes, and then also serious injuries associated with rear end crashes, which both occur at intersections, which supports the idea that we should take a closer look at those as well. And also keep in mind the large number of run off the roadway fixed object fatalities and serious injuries and the head-on collision ones. We'll talk a bit about that when we get to our major arterials as well. Next slide, please. And this one you saw as well last week, the last one of the review slides, in that it shows the most frequent crash contributing factors. And once again, a crash contributing factor is something that increases the likelihood of a crash or its severity. So, and also these don't add up to 100% because most crashes have more than one factor that's involved. So, and this one shows that people not wearing safety belts is a contributing factor in 27% of fatalities. But also note the prominent position of pedestrian crashes, and then crashes at intersections, roadway departures, speed-related involvement. So these also inform why it was that we selected all the areas with pedestrians, intersections, and major arterials. And next slide, please. Finally, the last of our sort of review from last month. This slide shows the different functional classes of roadways that we have, minor arterials, that they're listed in the middle, collectors, major arterials, et cetera. On the left is the lane miles of each of those in our region. On the right is both the serious injuries and the fatalities. And what really popped out here for us is that, while there's a lot of fatalities and serious injuries on minor arterials and major arterials, there's a lot fewer lane miles on major arterials, which suggests that we should focus on those a little bit. And next slide, please. So, based on this information that came out of this phase 1 analysis, and also because our budget was limited us to doing 3 deeper dives only, clearly there's a lot more areas that could stand a deeper look, and maybe we can get to that sometime in the future, but we had budget for 3. So we had to also have a technical advisory panel for this study that consists of Tim Kearns from the Maryland Highway Safety Office, as well as Shoma Day from the District Department of Transportation, and Stephen Reed from the Virginia Department of Transportation, as well as TPB staff. And it was based on discussions amongst this technical advisory panel that we came up with these 3 areas to do a deeper look into. So next slide, please. We're going to look at pedestrians first, so next slide. So this one shows the jurisdictional breakdown of pedestrian fatalities, serious injuries, and total crashes. And this is reminiscent of some of the slides you saw last time, only it's focused just on pedestrians here. So, and it's also for these are a 5-year period from 2013 to 2017. And once again, the consultant team has color-coded these cells in the table to highlight where the higher numbers are. So we can see that for these 5 years, Prince George's County had the most pedestrian fatalities, followed by Montgomery County, Fairfax County, and the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia had the most pedestrian serious injuries, followed by Fairfax County, Montgomery County, and Prince George's County, and that the District of Columbia had the most total crashes. Next slide, please. So a common way to normalize pedestrian fatality data is to divide it by the population. So that's what this chart shows. We see the jurisdictions from top to bottom ranked or in rank order from lowest to highest population. And then the population is sort of visualized on the left by the blue bar that shows the proportion, the population per 100,000 per 1,000 people, I'm sorry. And then the smaller, brighter blue bar on the right shows the number of fatalities that happened in that jurisdiction over the 5 years. And then the stacked bar to the right of that shows the rate per 100,000 people. So, clearly Prince George's County has the highest rate, but also interestingly, and this kind of came out in some similar figures last month, that Charles County, which did not have a lot of fatalities when we look at it in terms of the whole region, but when you look at it in terms of their population, it also popped out as being higher than everything except for Prince George's County. So next slide, please. So this slide shows something interesting in that it breaks down the pedestrian fatalities, serious injuries, and crashes by the time of day when they occurred. So what clearly stands out here is that the fact that pedestrian fatalities go up in the evening, especially between 6 p.m. and midnight. Now, this is likely due in part, to more pedestrians being out and about during that time, but also it corresponds to the hours of, when things are darker outside. So, and I want to put the next slide up because this will continue the story, I think, with the next slide. And so this slide breaks the same data down by month. And here we can see that it shows quite a spike in pedestrian fatalities, serious injuries, and crashes during the months of October, November, and December. I know you've seen similar charts on this with the Street Smart campaign information, and that's why they have a fall campaign, because of this time of increasing darkness. So this, I think this really clarifies and supports the thesis that it's perhaps the darkness and corresponding lack of visibility that is more of a primary factor in pedestrian deaths. And this also will lead us to the types of recommendations we're trying to pull together for you for next month. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we also looked at the pedestrian crashes according to where they happened on the roadway. And so with this, it's the thing that really kind of stands out is that the large number of fatalities, serious injuries, and total crashes that happened in the roadway, but not at an intersection or in an unmarked mid-block location. So now it would be very helpful to have some way to actually normalize these data. If there was a way we could divide the number of pedestrian fatalities here, for example, by the number of pedestrians in those locations, that would give us valuable information. However, we don't have that kind of data as far as like how many pedestrians are in different locations throughout the region. So my hypothesis is that there are many more pedestrians using marked crosswalks than there are crossing at unmarked mid-block locations, and yet look at the larger number of fatalities, serious injuries, and total crashes in those unmarked roadway locations. Which if true, would mean that the rate of pedestrian fatalities outside of crosswalks would stand up to be even higher, even more pronounced. And this is helpful information because it points us in the direction of finding ways to provide safer places for pedestrians to cross mid-block, and also finding ways to encourage more pedestrians to use crosswalks. However, you look at this chart though, I mean, pedestrian crashes within marked crosswalks, are also, too high as well. And so we need to find ways to make these crossings safer as well if we want to reduce pedestrian fatalities and serious injuries. So next slide, please. So this table shows the fatal pedestrian crashes, the serious injury pedestrian crashes, and total pedestrian crashes, but it breaks them down according to the age of the driver involved. So with this, it's interesting, I think, to see that, if you look at the 5-year spans between 20 and 60, there's kind of a consistent number in there, anywhere in the 30s, basically, which actually surprised me a little bit, but it was pretty consistent there. And the thing that really does stand out, though, is look at the number of fatal pedestrian crashes that were where the driver was older than 84. And if I had to take a guess, I would say that the number of drivers over 84 is probably not large compared to the number of drivers in those other age bands. So that really highlights that there's an issue here. So it also helps us think about, well, what we might be able to do to provide maybe more transportation options for older drivers so they don't necessarily have to be driving to get where they want to go. So anyway, next slide, please. And this was the slide that I added from the original mail out, just to kind of go over, well, the relevance of these deeper dives, this pedestrian dive in particular, in this case. So, we know from this that, the data imply that there's lack of visibility, and the lack of visibility in the evenings, especially in the winter months, increases the likelihood of drivers hitting pedestrians. It also shows that there's a preponderance of fatalities and serious injuries of pedestrians in the roadway and not at intersections. It also shows, that drivers over the age of 84 are involved in more pedestrian fatal and serious injury crashes than any other 5-year group. So this leads us to consider, how are we going to, provide recommendations that are informed by this information. And so, the recommendations we're working on include a lot of things for pedestrians, but these are some things that are highlighted with this data here. Finding ways to improve lighting at key locations throughout our network, finding ways to provide more alternatives to driving for older drivers, finding ways to implement more countermeasures such as pedestrian roadway safety audits to take a look at some of these locations with lots of fatalities and serious injuries. Installation of more pedestrian hybrid beacons, pedestrian refuge islands in those areas where they're having to cross wider roads, road diets to slow down speeds and make it more friendly for pedestrians as well. And maybe even more street smart-like activities with street teams and other things at other times of the year, other than the fall and spring campaigns. Maybe there's a way we could help with that too. So those are some of the things that are being considered as we're putting together a package of recommendations for you. So let's go to the next slide, please. All All right, so now we're going to take a look at the next area of deeper dive analysis, which are intersections. So let's go to the next slide. All right, and similar to what we showed for the pedestrians, this gives us the information as far as like where in our region jurisdictionally intersection crashes are happening, fatalities, serious injuries, and total crashes. And with this, we can see that Prince George's County has had the most intersection-related fatalities, whereas Fairfax County, by a significant amount, has had the most serious injury crashes at intersections, and the district has the most overall total crashes at intersections in our region. And then the next slide, please. Again, breaking it down by time of day, we do see a pattern that seems somewhat similar to what we saw for pedestrians with the hours between 5 and midnight seeming to be when there's increased numbers of fatalities at intersection crashes. However, in serious injuries, it's much more of a high point in the sort of afternoon peak hour time between like 3 o'clock and 7 o'clock p.m. I'm not sure exactly what it is. One could speculate that maybe speeds are slower during that time, so maybe some of the crashes that would have been fatalities are showing up as serious injuries, although that's speculation. We don't have in this chart that kind of data. And again, with the total crashes kind of clustering in the evening rush hour time period. And let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so for intersections, we can also take a look at, well, what was the intersection control type at the intersections where these crashes happened? Was there an officer, a flagger there, which is obviously a very small number of intersections. Signalized intersections clearly stand out as having the most fatalities, serious injuries, and total crashes. It's not really surprising in a sense because signalized intersections happen to be a feature of major arterials, minor arterials, where there is more traffic in general. So you would expect that there might be more crashes at those locations. However, it does definitely highlight that finding ways to make our signalized intersections safer is something that we're going to want to include as part of our recommendations. So with that, let's go to the next slide, please. And here it combines what we know about intersections with what we also saw earlier about the number of crashes that are happening on major and minor arterials. And here we see that for intersection crashes, the majority of the fatalities, serious injuries, and total crashes are happening on those major and minor arterials. So let's then go to the next slide. And this chart is, I think, really a good way to take a look at these things, because what it shows is in the blue bar, it shows the percentage of intersection crashes that had this type of and then the orange line shows the percentage of fatalities and serious injuries associated with that. And here you can see that intersections, the left turn angle crashes and left turn oriented crashes account for nearly 40% of all the intersection related crashes, but they also account for almost half of the fatalities and serious injuries. So it's a very dangerous operation, taking a left turn at an intersection, and that's something that we might consider looking at more closely as far as what we can do about that. Also, you can see rear end crashes are another significant proportion of intersection crashes. They tend to be less serious when it comes to fatalities and serious injuries because there's a lower percentage of those crashes that end up in fatality or serious injury. And then you notice that the side swipe crashes have a significant number of those, but the seriousness of those is less because there's very few relative fatalities and serious injuries. But then look at the next three where you run off the roadway or you hit a fixed object, if there's a pedestrian involved, and if it's a head-on collision. So pedestrian involved intersection crashes are less than 4% of our region's crashes, but they account for over 15% of our region's intersection crashes, but they account for over 15% of our pedestrian fatalities at intersections. Clearly something we need to look at. And then also the head-on crashes, which are related in some way to the running off the roadway fixed object, meaning that the vehicle departed the lane and came to a bad end. And so those are also quite dangerous as far as crashes go, as far as the proportion of fatalities and serious injuries that happen with them. So And of course, bicycles are involved in very few of those crashes, but again, relatively unprotected like pedestrians, they have a high fatality and serious injury rate when those crashes do happen. So let's go to the next slide, please. So how is this going to help us to come up with recommendations and ideas for your consideration next month? Well, I mean, we see that the data show that most intersection crashes are at signalized intersections along arterials. We also know that one of the most dangerous types of maneuvers at intersections are angle or left turn crashes, and that clearly intersection crashes with pedestrians are quite a serious problem at intersections, accounting for only 4% of the crashes, but 15% of the fatalities. So what does this mean as we're working on developing our recommendations for you? Well, it means that we need to find ways that we can make our intersections safer. And here are some of the things that if we can do more of these kinds of things one way or another in our region, we would probably have a good impact on our numbers. If we had more roundabouts, if we improve our left turn or right turn channelization at more of the intersections in our region. Also, implementing the leading pedestrian intervals at more intersections. A lot of intersections in our regions do have these features, especially in the district, but there's a lot of intersections that don't have that either, so we could do more of that. Also, increasing the visibility of our intersections with the installing the LED heads and reflective backplates. And I think you might recall that Stephen Reed mentioned that they're really pushing this effort in Northern Virginia and throughout the state as part of their efforts. And then applying high friction treatments at intersections that have high numbers of rear end collisions or have polished pavements, things like that. And you might recall that Maryland is starting to really look into and do some work on high friction treatments, especially, and in their case on curves and things, which are also an area where they're useful. So anyway, so it's these kind of things, and I know that the board might not be directly implementing these things, but there will be ways that we will recommend that you can help influence getting more of these things to happen in our region going forward. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so looking at our third area, major arterials. Next slide, please. And again, we have our taking a look at how these break down with our jurisdictions. Similar patterns, not identical to other ones that we've seen with, in this case, Prince George's County having the most major arterial crashes are along major arterials, fatal crashes and serious injury crashes. However, the most serious injury crashes are in Montgomery County at major arterials, followed by Fairfax County, Prince George's County, and the District of Columbia. And the District of Columbia, as is a feature, these other charts too, has the most total crashes, major arterials in the region. So let's go to the next slide. So now, we did find good information, especially when we're looking at pedestrians. We look at time of day, and this we looked at the intersections and with the major arterials as well. A very similar looking chart to what we had for intersections with fatalities along major arterials being higher from 6 p.m. to midnight, but the serious injuries clustered more in the evening peak or the afternoon peak period. And so let's go to the next slide, please. If we look at the day of the week for major arterial crashes, there's an interesting feature here that the Saturdays and Sundays have stand out as far as the number of fatalities along major arterials in our region. And the serious injuries, they're actually pretty close. I mean, but I think that it's interesting that's the weekend. A speculation, I don't know exactly why this is, but I mean, it could again relate to speeds. If there's more ability to travel faster during the weekends, that could be part of this. But let's take another look at some more information and take the next slide, please. All right, so similar to what you saw for the intersections, we can do a similar kind of breakdown here for the major arterials. So again, on major arterials, the 22.4% of, 34.7% of all the major arterial crashes are rear end crashes. However, it's still a significant amount of percentage of fatalities and serious injuries at 22.4%. But then if you look at the next one, the angle or left turn crashes, also a very significant proportion of crashes along major arterials and a higher fatality and serious injury rate. Of course, the side swipe similarly, but then let's look again at the running off the roadway or hitting fixed objects and head-on crashes. Here it's even more pronounced than it was at the intersections because I would guess a lot of this is because if you're running off the roadway or hitting a fixed object on a major arterial, you could be going faster than the conditions permit in often cases. And so those tend to be very serious crashes with a high percentage of fatalities and serious injuries on the run off the roadway and then head-on collisions as well. And of course, pedestrians. So we saw that pedestrians, the preponderance of fatal and serious injuries with pedestrians not at intersections, at mid-block or in the roadway crashes, and that gets highlighted here as well by looking at the major arterial collisions involving pedestrians and just how dangerous that is for pedestrians there. So let's take the next slide, please. So what does this tell us, and how can we use this to help inform what we present to you next month? So we know that most of the fatalities and serious injuries on major arterials are associated with angle left turn crashes. And we know that there's issues about where vehicles are leaving the roadway, hitting fixed objects, or hitting another vehicle head on. That's a high proportion of fatalities and serious injuries. And again, with pedestrians, I mean, they're less than 4% of the crashes on our major arterials, but they result in over 16% of fatalities and serious injuries. So what does that mean for the kinds of things we can think about for trying to get more of these done? We have to find more ways to keep the vehicles on the roadway by maybe adding more rumble strips. We see a lot of those in the region. That's a well-established countermeasure that works. There's also, on the major arterials, if you have curves, adding better visibility to the treatments so people see curves coming earlier. Again, high friction treatments that I know the Maryland had talked about with their presentation as well on curves to help keep vehicles on the roadway. There's also an FHWA proven countermeasure, a safety edge, which basically helps keep vehicles control they leave the roadway. Also, we can identify roadways that would benefit from road diets to reduce speeds and improve pedestrian fatalities, improve pedestrian safeties, I mean. And so there's a lot more than this, but this just highlights a few of the ways that we're thinking about the data that are going to help us come to you next month with recommendations. So let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, I guess that's it. So I am ready to take any questions, I guess.
Thank you, John. That was a really fascinating presentation. I'm going to start with questions from the District of Columbia.
Thanks. This is Charles Allen. I had a couple of quick questions.
Mr. Allen?
All right, thank you. One of the questions I had, first off, John, thank you again. I appreciate this. This is really helpful to do this deeper dive into this. So I guess one question I had was related to, I'm trying to pull up the exact slide you had. It was slide number 8. So pedestrian crash severity by location, and you've got it broken down into unknown, unmarked crosswalk, marked crosswalk, et cetera. Did you break down the data, for example, let's say that there was a right on red and the pedestrian is in a marked crosswalk, but is struck in a right on red. Is there any way the data helps tell us anything about that other than just saying that the person was in a crosswalk? Do you understand what I'm asking there?
I do. We have not broken the data down that way. As far as is the question about, is it possible to do that level of analysis? I might, if it's okay, we do have our consultant on the phone too that did the actual technical data analysis, and he might be able to help us figure out if that's possible to do what you just said. I don't know. Are you there, Corey?
Yeah, I'm on. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, so we didn't go quite to that level. We did look at things like age, where we looked at the pedestrian versus the driver's age. And then the pedestrian slide that you're referring to, John, do you have that to pull up?
Sergio, get that.
Pedestrian location one. So this was based on a number of factors for, I forget which, but for one of the jurisdictions, it was based on pedestrian. Two of the jurisdictions, it was based on pedestrian action. and one it was based on actual pedestrian location. So there were already limitations in regards to actually determining where the pedestrian was at the time of impact. And then so combining that with right turn on red, which I don't believe we had for every jurisdiction as well, would be very difficult. I guess we can look into seeing if that's possible to combine, but how accurate that pedestrian location and then how accurate that movement for that vehicle is, and then combining those may make for some inaccurate statistics is I guess what I'm concerned with, especially when you consider the number of just unknowns, even just for the pedestrian location here that you're seeing. And then yeah, I mean, the jurisdictions would be more likely to use right turn on red the same way, so that would hopefully be coded similarly. But for pedestrian locations, it was already kind of a mix and match effort to try and figure out if they were. We could figure out where they were, but not always if it was at a legal way or at a legal time. They might have crossed mid block but wasn't marked. They might have been using the marked crosswalk but was it at a time when the bulb was flashing or telling them to do so. So there's already a lot of other additional questions that we'd probably like to know in regards to that before we got to exactly what the.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate that. That kind of helps me understand both.
That's a good question.
What could be looked at, but also what limitations may exist in that. And then I had one other quick question, and that was, as I look at, for example, the crashes by jurisdiction. So I'll use. I know you broke this down in a couple of ways. I'll just look at slide number 4, which is the pedestrian crash severity by jurisdiction. Did you, or in your analysis, and when you come back to us again next month, is there any way in which you look at this kind of within the jurisdiction? And so I'll just use the District of Columbia as an example. We have a really significant disparity between East and West in terms of severe collisions, serious injuries, pedestrian fatalities, pedestrian serious injuries that are much more on the eastern half of our city than on the western half of our city. So as we try to think about our own interventions and our efforts, it would help us also be able to look a little bit deeper into almost like the sub area of the jurisdiction, because within our own jurisdiction, we're going to see that we actually have a pretty stark divide in terms of which communities are being most impacted. And not surprisingly, it's going to happen in our lower income communities where we built highways and everything else in the middle of them. So that would be helpful. So I don't know if you can pull that out, or just what you might be able to kind of add to that flavor as we look to help dissect what solutions could be there.
So yes, so we do have information as far as the exact location of all these crashes. So, and we are the consultant is currently working on interactive online GIS maps that can help do these really sort of sub-jurisdictional dives and take a look at the data, at a finer level of detail. So that is, whether or not that will be available for discussion at the next meeting, I'm not sure, but certainly I'm hopeful that whatever happens in June, that there will be additional, it won't be the end of the story when it comes to safety. And now that we have this this database that we put together, we want to be able to use it to do a more detailed look. The district has the concerns you mentioned, and I think probably a lot of other jurisdictions would like to see something more specific as far as a part of their jurisdiction, as opposed to looking at the the overall numbers like we've shown so far. So I think yes, we can get to some of that. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to some of that by the next meeting.
Okay. Well, I would definitely love to see that. I think we've got, again, I agree with you. There's probably plenty of other jurisdictions where we see this disparity play out. But as we think about what our interventions can and should be, that could be helpful data. So again, thank you very much. This was really helpful, and I look forward to continuing this conversation and the work ahead. Thank you.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi, this is Vic Weisberg. Sorry, I wanted to add to Mr. Allen's point about sort of the deeper drill down and within jurisdiction, but also looking regionally as well. So to his point, I think one variable that you might want to look at is equity emphasis area, but the two that sort of leapt immediately to our minds was road maintenance type and road maintenance / ownership type. And I think that you'll see some similarities with arterials in particular, but I think that will help with a greater drill down, but also, posted speed and speed type on various roads. So looking at speed, looking at type of maintenance and equity emphasis areas may help, our ability to focus countermeasures and the ability to address these.
That's a great comment. I'm going to go back to asking for questions by jurisdiction. Back to DC. Okay, I'm going to go to Maryland. Did I hear somebody from DC? Or is that just feedback? All right.
It's Emmett Jordan from Greenbelt.
Jordan?
Yeah, thank you. I have a comment, a couple of quick comments. John, thank you for this important work, and it's really, really helpful to be able to see these numbers and broken down. One of the conclusions, though, with injury by severity, by time of day, I'm thinking that perhaps it's not just darkness, but I think in some cases it might be the level of fatigue or awareness on the part of drivers as the day wears on. Particularly when you're stuck in traffic and you're driving, you get a little sleepy sometimes. So I don't know how you can go about factoring that in, but I think the awareness and fatigue on the part of drivers could be a factor in those numbers in terms of the time of day. The other point that I wanted to bring up is, I appreciate the disaggregation of the information for pedestrians and cyclists in terms of the number of crashes and the number of fatalities. It might be very impactful, in reporting, high-level reporting, to point out that if you aggregate those numbers together for fatalities in various industries, it would be injuries. It would be 6% of all crashes and 20% of all fatalities and serious injuries. So if that, for a top-level headline kind of a item, that might be something that you want to point out.
Great, thank you. I think that those are great ideas for digging further, as we go on, and I definitely appreciate that. And I like the idea. It wouldn't be hard to show. Aggregated, we could show them together and disaggregated in a chart to get the benefits of both ways of looking at it.
Also, I had this is Denny Tavares, Prince George's County member. So just so that I'm just clear on what we're looking at. This is data gathered over a year, over several years. What's the time frame of the data that we're looking?
The data is it's 5 years of data, 2013 through 2017.
Okay. And one thing that I found that I would be interested in, obviously, would be the racial breakdown of the people who were fatally or severely injured, just for purposes of marketing and educational campaigns, and how to address that. Because I recognize what Emmett was saying in terms of the time of day. I think that is very important, because sometimes if people are wearing clothing that is too dark, and its area is not properly lighted, it's very difficult to see somebody on the road. So I mean that there may be other factors as well that I think, and the other issue that Vic properly highlighted is the ownership of the road. For us, it's also very big. I remember I think our last meeting, there were several sections in my district that were highlighted, and they were mostly on state roads. where these fatalities are occurring. So this is something that is very serious, at least in my district, and I believe in District 8 in my county. Okay, which is in Indian Head on 210. So those are the two comments that I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else from Maryland before we move to Virginia?
County. Quick question regarding, what is it? It's slide 12. Clearly, the number of incidents related to left turn angles. Curious if in that evaluation, you looked at the cross lights or the walk signals to see if those had any role to play, whether they were delayed or quite frankly even functioning. But wondering, depending on the jurisdiction or the area, sometimes those allow greater lead times, and curious if you found anything out in that.
Okay, I'm not sure if that data was in the crash reports or not that are the basis of this report, but maybe Corey Hopwood could just quickly let us know if that is available or not.
Yeah, again, I think for that level of data, we'd probably have to read each narrative in a lot of cases. Mostly if something's malfunctioning or the timing of even the presence of some of those signal types wouldn't be noted within the crash report data without deeper into the narrative or doing some form of GIS analysis where we're taking those known signal types or whatever we're looking for specifically in this case and cross-referencing them with the crash locations.
Good. I think that perhaps another thing that we can look at moving forward is if we do have locations that come out as being a concern that need further analysis, and we somehow can be involved in doing some additional analysis, some encouraging road safety audits, things like that. Those kind of like real details will come out with that kind of an effort too. But that's a great point. It's like to try to get to some of the details of how exactly what's going on with these crashes and what could be tweaked or fixed in the system.
Right. Yeah. Exactly, and while there might be best practices that each of our jurisdictions adopt, if the data are telling us otherwise, that there need to be more lead times, or at least those jurisdictions with more lead times have less incidents and deaths, then I think that's absolutely worth pursuing. So thank you.
Thank you.
So this is Gary Ehrenridge, Montgomery County, and I want to thank the presentation and the series of presentations that we've had. One presentation ago, I believe, we talked about some of the underlying other factors that were not roadway related, wearing seatbelts and under the influence. And I know we're going to hear a good presentation on the latter coming up. But the issue really is you got to kind of overlap all of the data that you have to some extent with those other variables, because how many of the fatalities on certain facility types are not wearing seatbelts? Obviously, the higher speed off the road are very important, and what maybe the difference between a fatality and a serious injury might come into play. The other, I think, important point that we need to remember is that, what is the impact on things? You haven't talked about it. I think it's been alluded to on like red light cameras and speed cameras. And so I think it's important to also look at that and keep that in mind when you do your recommendations.
Thank you. I'm going to make a call for questions from Virginia, and also just note that you do have a chat function and email abilities to ask questions, but I do want to kind of move this along. So do we have anybody from Virginia with questions?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, who was this?
I think there are a couple of us, Kristen Dorsey and Rodney Lush, trying to recognize.
Mr. Dorsey. Oops.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This just continues what has been discussed by Mr. Jordan, Ms. Taveras, and others. So this is a great presentation, Mr. Sherman. And, the data naturally and understandably look at indicators that are observable. And the great thing about that is it sort of gives us a window into what might be some of the infrastructure improvements that we can make, some of the public investment improvements that we can make. But as has been noted, there are other factors that go beyond the observable and are more behavioral, and whether it be distracted drivers, fatigued drivers, or toxicology influenced drivers and pedestrians for that matter, getting a look at all of those data is really going to be important to figure out how we marry the infrastructure improvements with the public awareness and other efforts. So I'm wondering, I realize that's a huge lift for you all to look at that narrative data that may get at those behavioral factors. Is there anything that this effort could produce for the jurisdictions to go about routinely collecting those data so that it can be easily assimilated with this broader analysis?
Well, so yeah, that is a big lift, but I think that a couple things that come to mind. One is that I'm very hopeful, and it seems by the interest from everyone here that we're going to be, there's this particular study that we have a certain budget for that we can do a certain amount of analysis in, and then there's going to be, further analysis that we'll need to do to answer a lot of these very important questions and very helpful questions. So I'm hoping that this is a first step, and that we're going to be able to do more of this, going forward, which might be able to answer some more of these questions. And then the other thing about, if there's capability to maybe look at the narrative, I think that, that's something that if we could find the resources to do a deeper look at that, we can certainly, we have the data now, and we have the narratives in the data, so we can do it. It's a question of being able to find the resources to do that kind of even deeper dive, like you said. So I think that as long as this particular study isn't the end of the road when it comes to our safety work, and there's more that we could do, that's something that we could look at.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, the other gentleman wants to speak?
Yes, ma'am. My name is Rodney Lusk from Fairfax County. Just wanted to note that I really appreciate the presentation, and specifically what you outlined as it relates to pedestrian crashes and fatalities, and thinking about this issue as it relates to that kind of the mid-block outside of the intersections. And I'm really, really interested in seeing some additional recommendations that you might have in this regard. But just thinking out loud, are there any like innovative technologies or any emerging tech areas that could be used to help us address some of these issues as it relates specifically, I think, to this mid-block situation? Are there like sensors, or are there, video and sensor capabilities, drone technologies that we can look at? Or are there places that might be deploying some of these alternative things to help address this problem that is just, it's pretty vexing. And as you indicated, there are people who are impacted, their lives are lost, families that are, hurt by this. And in many cases, it's just so unnecessary. So if there are things that we could consider, maybe even different, and I like the approach on the lighting and the refuge islands, but I'm just trying to think, is there something even beyond that we could look at and consider as well?
Well, I think that there is there's a lot of promise and hope in some ways with all the new technologies that are coming on board. Like, hey, it's going to be, how can this be harnessed to make things not just safer, but also our society more productive and these things. And there is there probably are things on the horizon that are going to be very helpful with that. We haven't done a deep look into what new vehicle sensors, what kind of new things might be out there that could help us as part of this study. We really focused it on, when we were working with our consultant team, we're like, tell us what tell us what's been proven to work, what the evidence is in right now. We're going to work with that. That doesn't mean that we, hopefully we'll be able to look at this, additional technology going forward. But when it comes to things related to automated vehicles and stuff, that was not considered within our current scope of our studies so far. But it's a great idea to try to harness what could be that could help us forward.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess that could be done in some future analysis and study of what you're suggesting, at least.
So I'm going to jump in here, and I apologize. We're a little behind schedule, and we do have two really important discussions that we still need to have. Mr. Letourneau, I saw you waiting up there. I'm going to let you speak, and then I'm going to ask you any questions from WMATA or the federal agencies, and then we're going to move on to the next item.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very briefly, the most interesting thing to me out of this was the fact that the majority, the highest prevalence of these crashes are on Saturday and Sunday. And that was not at all what I would have expected. You don't have to tell us right now, but can you get us what the overall traffic volume was? Because I'm guessing that on Saturday and Sunday, it's down significantly over what it would be on a normal weekday. And yet we have more crashes. So that's definitely telling us something about who's driving and what their state of mind is. But do you have the volume data as well that you could get us by day of week?
Well, that certainly was an interesting slide there. And let me say that I'll get back to you on what we have or what we don't have and see what we can come up with.
Thank you.
Terrific. And I know that there are more of you that have questions, and I would just suggest if you want to chat them into the box and we can look at them later, or send an email in. But I do want to get us moving to the next item. One thing I did want to note is that we talked a lot about having questions about, can we get this information? Can we get that information? Are there improvements in reporting across jurisdictions that we can make that give us better information from the reporting agencies that would make it more a cohesive ability to get the kind of data that would have to be, dredged out of a narrative, and just that's food for thought. So with that, did WMATA or any of the federal agencies have any questions? Hope not. Okay. Thank you so much. This is really great information, and I know we're all very, very interested in it. So I know that there will be a lot of follow-up. Please send your questions in. So thank you very much, John and Corey, for your time.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to talk about the Washington Regional Alcohol Program Safety Update. We know that alcohol plays a large role in roadway accidents. Nationally, about 30% of fatalities are attributed to impaired driving. Many of us have programs to address this issue, and there are private sector programs and public-private partnerships working on this issue. Today, we are fortunate to have with us the executive director of one of the region's longest-serving public-private partnerships, the Washington Regional Alcohol Program, Kurt Erickson. I understand that this partnership began in 1982 and is working to prevent drunk driving and underage drinking through public education, innovative health education programs, and advocacy. Mr. Erickson, will you share with us the findings of the most recent How Safe Are Our Roads report and your ideas on how we can reduce crashes caused by impaired driving? Mr. Erickson, you have the floor.
Madam Chairman, thank you, and I'll try to get you guys back on schedule, and I'll do that from maybe starting on the next slide, if we could advance to that. That's what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about what the Washington Regional Alcohol Program is. We have just completed a 27th annual How Safe Are Our Roads report. That's what I'll be detailing for you today. Be assured, however, that whereas it's a 17-page report, I'm really going to just focus on 4 pages, and then ending today with some recommendations on specifically what we can do in terms of preventing drunk driving, specifically in the greater Washington region. We've done this presentation already to the TPB Technical Committee on April 3rd, also through WebEx, and through the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Chiefs of Police back in the good old days when you could do this in person back on February 26th. But just to tell you, so RAP is a 38-year-old public-private partnership formed to fight drunk driving and underage drinking. The chairman noted that we do this through public education, innovative health education programs, and advocacy. But I think if people know us at all, they know us through a free safe ride service that we've done since 1991 called Sober Ride that used to be done by cabs, and since 2017 it's been done by rideshare services to get people home safely rather than driving home drunk during various high alcohol use holidays. In fact, we've had over 80,000 people take advantage of this program since we started it back in 1993. But what I wanted to focus on today is the 27th annual publication that we did, the Washington Regional Alcohol Program, has done with the Council of Governments. We released it in January 2020. It's got 2018 data. I will tell you that the 2019 data is being collected now, so this is may come across as a little dated, but it is the most recent data that's out there. But that said, we're collecting 2019 data as we speak. And I should also mention as a preface that the geography represented in this report may be a little bit different than the metropolitan planning organizations, whereas we were going to talk about drunk driving trends specifically in the District of Columbia, specifically in Montgomery County and Prince George's County, and specifically in Arlington, Fairfax, Loudoun, and Prince William. So it doesn't include Frederick or Charles counties or some of the broadening areas. That's only for the fact that that's been the paradigm that we've been locked into that really goes back to the service territory that are governed by RAP's own articles of incorporation. So that said, again, it's a 17-page report. I'm just going to focus on 4 of the pages real quick, and if we can go to the next slide. In general, again, this is everything that I covered, but in general, what you should know is that traffic fatalities, whether they're alcohol related or not, all traffic fatalities are up in 2018, and they're up for the 2nd year in a row. That's a concern that we should be concerned with. But what I want to talk about specifically are drunk driving trends. And if we can go to the next slide. Specifically, we're going to talk about drunk driving fatalities, drunk driving crashes, drunk driving injuries, and drunk driving arrests. And as this slide tells you, that it's a mixed bag, but there is good news to be found. The first part of the good news is that very first statistic that you have in front of you, which is that drunk driving fatalities in 2018 went down slightly, but nonetheless went down. They went down a little over 1%. Conversely, drunk driving crashes went up 0.5%. Drunk driving injuries probably had the biggest variance in the fact that they went down by over 6%. And drunk driving arrests, which is going to be something that we can certainly talk about when we get to that point, 'cause it's always an interesting barometer of how any region is doing in terms of combating drunk driving. Those actually numbers went up surprisingly, and they went up by 3.5%. Go to the next slide. One of the issues of concern here is that nationally, 29% of all traffic deaths in this country still involve drunk drivers being defined as somebody with a 0.08 or above blood alcohol concentration. Historically, the greater Washington area has been below that level, and I clearly attribute that to, I think there's a high level of awareness about impaired driving. There are certainly alternatives to impaired driving in the greater Washington area, whether it be population density, transit, rideshare use, and so forth. And again, even putting RAP's own Sober Ride program in there, and it's taking 80,000 would-be drunk drivers off very roadways, has made us usually below the national average in a good way. But what these numbers bear out is that we're just really about 1% higher than the national average. So again, 29% of all U.S. traffic deaths involve drunk drivers. Here in the greater Washington area, it's 30%. Go to the next slide if we could. So this gets into the meat of what we're going to be talking about. This starts, again, with total traffic fatalities. The numbers on the very bottom that you see, the 281, is the number of traffic deaths that occurred in the greater Washington area as previously defined, specifically in 2018. And you can see that it's a nearly 4% increase from the previous year. What's concerning is that this is the 2nd year increase for this specific statistic. Again, we're not talking about drunk driving fatalities yet. We're talking about general traffic fatalities. Getting into drunk driving fatalities, however, we can go to the next slide. As previously mentioned, we've had a 1.16 increase in these 100% preventable traffic deaths, that being drunk driving fatalities, where somebody with a 0.08 or above was involved. At the same point, this has been overall a fairly steady number. You'll notice that some of the variances, and I probably should have prefaced this as well to go, I try not to get too deep into the numbers. You'll find some very incremental numbers here, and there are things that could tremendously change these numbers. Single incidents, single crashes that could tremendously change these numbers. But on a broad scale, I'm just going to point out that some of the regions that had a largest variance in terms of an increase of these drunk driving fatalities in 2018 versus the previous year was Prince William County, that went from 6 such fatalities to 14, Fairfax County, that went from 12 such fatalities to 18. Conversely, and offsetting the numbers that we just mentioned, U.S. Park Police, or what you see as national parks in the region, which are U.S. Park Police reported numbers, So you can see that these are generated from traffic incidents that happen on the BW Parkway or the GW Parkway. Those actually went down in 2018. Those went from 9 to 5, and in Prince George's County, they went from 34 to 24. If you were to go even further back in this report to look at like 2017 as an example, these most recent numbers offset what was reported in 2017. And by the way, just when I say reported, the Washington Regional Alcohol Program, the nonprofit that actually produces this report, it's actually COG that we contract to do this. So the COG reported numbers for 2017 for those two Maryland localities, Montgomery County and Prince George's County specifically, they doubled between 2016 and 2017. We thought that was a data issue in terms of how there was a data collection differentiation in that year that seemed to have finally caught up. We were hoping that it was a data issue as opposed to a trend of anybody doubling their number of drunk driving deaths. And that seems to have been borne out as well in the fact that those numbers seem to go back down to what would be more customary than what had been previously reported. And specifically, I'm talking about Montgomery County going from 8 drunk driving deaths to 7, and Prince George's County going from 34 to 24. We can go to the next slide. Drunk driving injuries, another good barometer. This is the one that had the greatest variance. This went down over 6%. What's interesting to note is that this went down for a second year in a row. That's always great news. And you had certainly the localities that were contributing to that downward trend. Again, U.S. Park Police numbers, again, BW Parkway and GW Parkway, from 46 to 33 such injuries. City of Fairfax had a tremendous variance going from 17 such injuries to 7, and the City of Falls Church from 11 to 7. Conversely, on an uptick basis of a great variance is the City of Manassas Park that went from 5 drunk driving injuries in 2018, from 2017 to 13 such injuries in 2018. And we go to the next slide. Drunk driving crashes. This is the one that's been fairly steady, but to be accurate, it's gone up about 0.5%, 0.56 specifically. Conversely, you've had some areas that had more greater variance in cities that actually had downward trends than upward trends, and those specifically were the City of Fairfax that went from 26 drunk driving crashes to 10, and the City of Falls Church that went from 10 such crashes down to 4. And the next slide. I know I'm going through these fast, but I'll make sure that I try to catch you up on your schedule and make sure we have time for questions. Drunk driving arrests. This is always an interesting number because there's many ways to interpret this number and the fact that if drunk driving arrests are going up, well, people think the problem is increasing. It could also be a manpower, that there's increased manpower to actually do the arrests. And we've certainly had incidents of that in the past where even the smallest of localities had increased their deployment of officers from going to 1 to 2 and in fact doubled their number of arrests. I think the bigger challenge that we normally have for this statistic is the lack of full staffing that law enforcement agencies have throughout the greater Washington area. If you look at Virginia as but just an example, the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police will tell you that the majority of law enforcement agencies in that Commonwealth average downward staffing by about 16%. And that seems to translate into most recently Virginia's numbers of drunk driving arrests, but also convictions. What you can see here, though, is a little bit of bucking that trend, because again, it was followed by 4 years of declining numbers. The number of drunk driving arrests actually went up in 2018. They went up significantly. You can see greater variances in Loudoun County that reported 709 drunk driving arrests in 2018. This is versus 561 the year before. U.S. Park Police roads went from 305 to 371. Conversely, you did have a number of downward trends, and the greater variances of those include the City of Manassas that went down from 125 such arrests to 91, and the City of Alexandria that went from 397 to 292. Again, there's many factors that could contribute to this. One of the things that I do want to mention, however, is if you look at the District of Columbia numbers going left to right, is that in 2018, where this report focuses on, again, the regional numbers are a 3.5% increase in the number of arrests. Well, the District of Columbia more than doubled that. They had a nearly 8% increase in the number of drunk driving arrests in 2018. More importantly, that 2018 represented the 6th consecutive year of these increasing number of DUI arrests, specifically in the municipality of the District of Columbia. I think that's worth noting. And I don't necessarily think, by the way, I'm not castigating it in a negative light. In fact, being a nonprofit that works very closely with the Metropolitan Police Department, I can tell you that they are gung-ho on this issue. They've got gung-ho leadership on this issue, and I think that's representative of the numbers that are borne out here. That all said, you know, whether you take these numbers, these last ones as either a positive or a negative, it's universally a negative in the fact that we are still a region that annually arrests nearly 14,000 persons for DUI, and that nearly a third, 30% as previously reported, of all of our all traffic deaths still in this region involve drunk drivers. Again, this 100% preventable crime. Then go to the next slide. We were asked to talk on, when we presented this to the TPB Technical Committee, we were asked to talk about some of the recommendations that we have, and I wanted to, I'm not going to belabor these, and they are purposely oversimplified, but that we wanted to look at recommendations that could be applied at the state or at the local or at the regional levels, and really ones that could span, you know, both the legislative and administrative arena in terms of their implementation. And we came down, you know, I didn't even count these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 specifically, that I wanted just to mention really quickly, and we can talk about them in length if people have an interest. You know, our first recommendation in curbing these trends, or at least to recognize that whereas drunk driving competes with other very valid traffic safety issues that may be getting more media attention, whether it be distracted driving or aggressive driving or of course speeding, as we've all heard in the last couple of weeks, the fact of the matter is when you're still losing a third of your persons in traffic deaths in this region in drunk driving crashes, in these 100% preventable crashes, there's still more work to be done. So the obvious recommendation that we would have is to double down on what works. And two examples that I gave you there are sobriety checkpoints. It's really less, my opinion, the efficacy of those. It's more independent groups like the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety that have studied these anti-drunk driving operations conducted by law enforcement and found out that if they're done well, they can reduce drunk driving fatalities by as much as 20%. The previous presentation, we were talking about technology. And I mentioned just ignition interlocks as but one of those. Those are the in-car breathalyzers that a person will have to breathe into before their car is operable. And D.C., Maryland, and Virginia are all localities that require you that if you get convicted of a DUI in any of those localities, as a condition of a restricted license, you have to put an ignition interlock on your vehicle. That's great. And as of 2016, that was all localities. The problem is that it's not uniformly applied in the fact that you have Maryland, which is a smaller state than Virginia, but has over 13,000 persons on interlocks. Virginia, conversely, has less than 8,000 persons. And the District of Columbia, at least the last time I checked back in the fall, had but 14 persons on this proven effective anti-drunk driving technology. So the more universal application of that as a means of preventing drunk driving, I couldn't recommend more. You guys talked a little bit about seatbelts in the last presentation, so I won't belabor that. Safe to say that, you know, the single most effective measure to reduce crash-related deaths and injuries is the routine wearing of seatbelts. And that's why just about every drunk driving group is going to have that as part of their platform, and we're no different. Increased testing, you know, we talk a lot about drunk driving, but the fact of the matter is the numbers that I just gave to you are also inclusive of drugged driving numbers. Unfortunately, it's not so easy as to parse them out. We get often asked the question, well, you know, drug driving is we're getting indicators that it's up nationally. Is that happening regionally? And unfortunately, the data is not really there. And it's not a matter of going back and mining the data. It's the fact that too often when law enforcement get a BAC reading that allows for arrest, they're not usually doing a deeper dive panel-wise or with a blood test to actually find out if it was just alcohol or whether it was drugs, or in so many cases, whether it's polyuse of both substances. And that's why I mentioned that there was legislation introduced in Maryland, didn't advance as many legislation didn't with a premature ending session there in Annapolis. But there was legislation that both looked to have testing mandatory for all drivers involved in a fatal crash. In other words, if you have 3 drivers involved in a crash and there's a fatality involved, perhaps it's a fatality of a pedestrian, that all the drivers would be subject to testing. But then also an oral fluids pilot program, which was introduced this year. Again, I can't speak to the bill's lack of progress. It was such a unique year in Annapolis where the bill didn't get across the finish line, but it's something worthy of consideration. The last three, embracing technology. Again, I mentioned ignition interlocks. I should also mention that there's passive alcohol sensor testing being piloted right now. These are sensors in your vehicle that the driver isn't purposely engaging, but it's happening with or without the driver's consent or participation, where air is being taken from the driver only. This in Virginia and Maryland's case, where an actual air sensor is taking ambient air from the driver proximity and registering whether there's alcohol in it to prevent somebody from operating their car. These can also be tactile, where somebody is starting an engine or an armrest or even a steering wheel or even a retina scan to determine the same type things. There was also a bill this year about looking at new and emerging technologies. These are technologies I'm mentioning that are in existence now, but who's to say what's going to be in play 5 years from now? The last two, I go to the next slide, and the last slide, thank God for you all, is alternatives to DUI. We mentioned Sober Ride. This is the first year that this has been, we're a public-private partnership, but I am proud to say that this is the first year that we have our public partners each helping to fund this local and life-saving program. So our partners in the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia, either the DMVs or the Motor Vehicle Administration, are stepping up and helping the Department of Transportation. Rideshare, it's not just the fact of their market share they have of this effort, but it's the fact that when we switched our Sober Ride program to rideshare, our ridership tripled. It is absolutely the way to get the 21 to 35-year-old male audience, which is any group that's focusing on drunk driving, is looking at, to get them to get out of their cars and to get home safely by other means. And of course, we're going to have a challenge with that with the COVID environment. And then the expansion or the reintroduction of the evening hours of WMATA service. Drunk driving has many stereotypes. It does, because many of them are true, and one of those, or two of those, are that the majority of drunk driving incidents happen both at night and on the weekends, and these are the very times that WMATA has curtailed their hours, and we would like nothing better to have those reinstalled. And then lastly, I mentioned 16% staffing being down, but one local statistic. The full staffing and supporting a prioritization of DUI enforcement as a life-saving means, if just for the fact that, again, the saying is said, but it's worthy of repeating, that traffic safety is indeed public safety, and the full restoration of DUI enforcement, I think we'll only see positive numbers in terms of lives saved. So, sorry to go to the next slide just to have my contact information there. Actually, and I showed you that I didn't proof this before I said that I proofed it, but obviously I didn't check my own number. So my number actually there is 625-2303-2303. If you guys have questions, and the website for the organization is WRAP, W-R-A-P, again, stands for the Washington Regional Alcohol Program. It's WRAP.org, and we'll have actually a new website by the end of the week, so we're excited about that. But let me make sure I yield to any questions.
Mr. Erickson, thank you so much for a swift but thorough presentation. I'm going to call for questions, and I'm going to go in reverse order for a change. We're going to start with WMATA and any other federal agencies with questions. And just be mindful, it's 1:45 and we still have the run-through report.
Being mindful, I'm reserving my questions for the chat. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Anybody from Virginia?
Madam Chair, Dave Snyder, first of all, thank you for both of these highway safety presentations. And hopefully the recommendations from the alcohol will be folded into and be part of the overall recommendations that we're going to see at the next meeting. That's point number one. Point number two, and I know it's a bit of an add-on, but with all this assembled expertise, I'm wondering if we could also have at least a few notes at our next meeting. In view of the COVID-19 startups and in view of some data nationally about upswing in speeding, and even in some jurisdictions, increases in fatal accidents, even though miles driven are way down, is there anything special during the startup phases throughout our region that we ought to particularly be focusing on? Doing the things like seatbelts and enforcement and the other things that we've talked about, but is there anything in addition that we ought to be particularly focused on? For example, the intersection of car drivers that are used to having the road to themselves, and less that'll be the case, and pedestrians and bicyclists that are more out there now, used to having the road to themselves. And as we start up, we're going to get the mix of those things. So just a request that we have a couple notes and recommendations. Is there anything special we ought to be focusing on during these various startup phases? And thanks for great reports, and I look forward to recommendations on driving behavior, on traffic law changes, and on infrastructure changes. Thanks much.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. Any other questions from Virginia, quickly? Maryland? And again, you can type them into your chat or send an email after the call.
Yeah, Madam Chair, this is Jeffrey Hirsch from Maryland, and for Earl Lewis, who had to leave early. No other questions, just wanted to let Mr. Erickson know that that was an awesome presentation. Thank you.
Indeed. And any questions from the District of Columbia? All right, fantastic. That was a great program, and I look forward to getting more information and wrapping all this together. So thank you very much, Mr. Erickson, and thank you very much for your patience with us. We are on to the draft findings from the market assessment for the VRE MARC run-through service, the last item for today, and it's a briefing about the results from the TPB's market assessment and technical considerations for VRE MARC run-through service in the National Capital Region. This is a joint Maryland and Virginia study that both VRE and MARC helped us conduct. Our staff, Nicole, will introduce the study, and then we'll hear from Andrew Zalewski from the consultant team. Appreciate your patience with us, and you have the floor.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you about this project. So my name is Nicole McCall, and I serve as a TPB transportation planner. Before we dive into the slides, I just wanted to mention that if you'd like to learn more, there's a memo and draft report in today's packet. Next slide, please. So after I describe the project's background, our independent consultant for the study, Andrew Zalewski with Foursquare ITP, he will discuss the study's findings, the travel demand results, and key run-through considerations. Following his remarks, I'll touch on next steps. And to conclude the presentation, we've invited representatives from the Virginia Railway Express, VRE, and Maryland Transit Administration, MTA, to share their perspectives on the study and concept. Next slide, please. So first, the project's background. Next slide, please. So let's consider, how can we better integrate the region's rail network? What if VRE and MARC service continued beyond Union Station? We've been asking different versions of that question for a few decades now, actually. And 2 years ago, as a result of ongoing planning initiatives and infrastructure projects, including the MARC Cornerstone Plan, plans for Union Station's renovation and expansion, and track and station projects in Virginia, MTA and VRE determined that it was time for a fresh look at this concept. They asked TPB for support to conduct an independent market assessment for run-through service. And for TPB, this concept seemed worthy of consideration, maybe a little bit aspirational, and we certainly are pleased to be partners in this endeavor. The momentum and the support for this concept has increased over the course of this project. This is partially due to the fact that about a year after the initial request from MTA and VRE, Amazon announced it would locate its second headquarters in National Landing. Next slide, please. So let's just go over some of the benefits of run-through service really quickly. So residents would have access to more jobs and housing within a one-seat transit ride and can reduce their dependence on driving. The same applies to education, culture, recreation, and shopping opportunities. In turn, it would increase the talent pool within a reasonable commute to employers. It would increase transit options across the Potomac River. It might reduce passenger crowding on Metro Rail. It might reduce pedestrian crowding at Union Station. It might reduce or eliminate the need to transfer for MARC and VRE commuters who must do so to reach their final destination, at least some of them. It might reduce the current operational dependency on storing trains near Union Station during the middle of the day, where space really is at a premium. Next slide, please. So at the beginning of this study, we set off with 3 questions. What stations would attract run-through trips? How many riders would use the service? And what are some of the critical elements to consider while planning for run-through service? So let me take a moment to say this is a relatively small project. It is definitely not a comprehensive engineering feasibility study, and we're taking a first crack at this, and it's possible that additional elements might come up in more detailed studies or even as implementation is explored. So next slide, please. Our main goal for the study was to produce an objective market assessment. We also strive to be as collaborative as possible as we facilitated the Technical Advisory Committee, project stakeholders, and the consultant. The TAC included representatives from VRE, MTA, Maryland Department of Transportation, Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation, the District Department of Transportation, Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, and COG TPB staff. As I've mentioned, we hired an independent consultant to perform the analysis, Foursquare ITP, who was supported by Arl Banks and Associates. And I also want to, state there was a lot of interest in this study. And to allow for broad input, we also interviewed and sent out questionnaires to important stakeholders in the portion of the MARC and VRE service areas within the TPB planning region. Next slide, please. So our project scope included outreach, research, and technical analysis. So now, please allow me to introduce Andrew Zalewski with Foursquare ITP. He served as the consultant project manager and is going to outline the method used and the results of the market assessment, as well as considerations for future run-through service planning. Andy, please go ahead.
Hi, Nicole. Hi, everyone. I hope you guys can all hear me okay. You can go to the next slide, or actually skip two slides. So one more. Yeah, perfect. So really, one of the key questions that we were trying to answer as part of this study is what's the demand for run-through service today, and what will that demand look like in the future? A big challenge, or a challenge I should say for us, is that we're talking about a very large service area that goes beyond the TPB region. So we had to create a methodology that could look at travel demand, not just within the National Capital Region, but across a large swath of Maryland, Northern Virginia, all the way out to West Virginia. So we created this methodology broken into 4 key steps. The first is defining a travel shed. We took the MARC and VRE service area and broke it up into 22 zones. These zones represent where the vast majority of commuter rail trips start and end. The second step was then between those zones, understanding what is the total level of travel demand today, as well as in the future, and that's across all modes. We then developed estimates for how many trips or what share of trips run-through service would attract. And then combining that with the total trip volumes, we're able to come up with calculations and estimates for run-through ridership. You can go to the next slide. So just quickly, we use a wide variety of data, but we had 3 key inputs for the study. The first is Maryland statewide transportation model. We also relied extensively on VRE and MARC's own origin destination surveys. And then finally, the Census Transportation Planning Package provided a key input, especially for our base figures. Go to the next slide. So these 2 maps show essentially the service area that we had defined for MARC and VRE, and we broke it down into production zones. Production zones are typically where you would start and end your round trip, so your home location. And attraction zones, which are where the kinds of destinations that are really the reason you're taking the trip are located. So things like work, shopping, education. So like I mentioned, we broke these into 22 zones, and that number was determined based off of the availability of data. So in areas that had higher density of ridership, the zones were smaller and more defined based off of just one station. Go to the next slide. So our results fell into 4 broad categories. The first is that the travel sheds that we define, those zones, already cover a large share of the region's population, 4.9 million people, residents, and 1.4 million jobs. We looked at existing travel patterns today on MARC and VRE and found that a large share of MARC and VRE riders are already making what we're calling a run-through equivalent trip. It's about 13,900 people a day, and that's 27% of the combined weekday ridership of both railroads. So a run-through equivalent trip would be, for example, someone getting on at MARC on Baltimore, taking the train to Union Station, and then transferring to Metro Rail to go to Pentagon City. So it's a trip on commuter rail that ends within the service area of the other railroad. From there, we want to understand how many people overall are traveling between the two service areas of the railroad. On a typical weekday today, it's about 400,000. That will grow to 440,000 by 2030 and 476,000 by 2040. So there's a significant amount of regional travel between the two service areas. And then finally, we wanted to figure out what share of those riders would actually be using run-through service if it was available. We estimated that by 2030, that would be 16,200 weekday trips, growing to 17,500. Next slide, please. So we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into those numbers to understand actually where within the system we saw the greatest level of demand for run-through by specific corridors and alignments. And the demand was most concentrated on the corridor between Baltimore and Alexandria. So that would be either on the Penn and Camden line and VRE shared line, which is the part of VRE from Union Station to Alexandria. The only other corridor that showed significant levels of run-through demand were the Brunswick and VRE shared line corridor. Good, next slide. So this map shows where trips would be produced across the region, or I should say run-through trips would be produced. What we found is that there was demand on the production side for run-through trips across a large geography. The largest concentration was in Maryland, specifically in Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and Baltimore. Go to the next slide. And in terms of where people wanted to go, the biggest demand were for trips specifically to L'Enfant, that represented about 80% of the run-through market, followed by Crystal City. And then to a lesser extent, there were three other markets that showed promise: Alexandria, the Kensington-Rockville segment of the MARC corridor, and Silver Spring. And I should note, when I mention these stations, I'm talking about the catchment area served by these stations. So for example, L'Enfant includes about 40% of DC, as well as the Roslyn-Ballston corridor in Arlington. And you can go to the next slide, please. So in conclusion, when we look at run-through service, the greatest demand is between Baltimore and Alexandria. A large percentage of those trips are being generated in Maryland and then attracted to destinations in DC and Virginia. We saw some more modest demand on the Fredericksburg to Alexandria corridor. And then in terms of where those trips are being attracted to, L'Enfant is a major trip attractor, but then also Alexandria and Crystal City show some demand, and then even more moderate demand in Silver Spring and Rockville. Go to the next slide, please. So just a key caveat, like any modeling exercise, it's based off of certain assumptions on things like land use, travel behavior, and mode share. And any changes to some of those underlying assumptions, for example, run-through was implemented with a significantly different level of service from what MARC and VRE operate today, that would have an impact on those ridership estimates. Go to the next slide, please. And one more, thanks. So like Nicole mentioned, this wasn't a in-depth technical analysis, but we did explore some of the key considerations that would have to be addressed if run-through service was implemented. When we think about run-through service, there are three variables that are really going to impact how the service is implemented and developed. The first is timing. So over the next 10 years, there's a number of significant infrastructure improvements along the region's rail network. In particular, Union Station, its reconstruction, the Virginia Rail Improvement Program, which will be adding additional tracks to the VRE main line, L'Enfant Station reconstruction and an additional fourth track, and Long Bridge. And all of these projects in the long run are going to increase operational flexibility and capacity. But in the short run, these are things that any change in rail service will kind of have to navigate around. Also, another major impact that we need to be aware of is the service model. So the technical implications of run-through service that operates only a few trains a day is going to look very different from run-through service that has very high frequencies. And then finally, we have to be aware of the existing system resources and funding constraints that exist. Next slide, please. So in terms of run-through considerations, we identified 5 kind of key categories. The first is operations. So run-through service would have to determine how trains and engine service employees are going to be managed, how dispatching is going to be managed, the management of equipment, all critical considerations. On the mechanical side, we'll have to figure out the management of equipment availability, maintenance, servicing of trains. On the capital and capacity side, identifying rolling stock that's compatible with both networks. Investment in stations. There are several stations in both networks that are really set up only for one direction of travel. So if you have run-through service of trains going in both directions, additional platforms might be needed. You have to identify things like storage and layover space, and then warehouse space for spare parts. On the institutional side, union agreements would have to be renegotiated potentially. There also have to be negotiations for host railroad contracts, and you'd have to determine things like the cost sharing, pricing, and ticketing. And then finally, on the construction and maintenance of traffic side, run-through service would have to work around all of these other major capital investments occurring across the region. So that's all I have in terms of the technical and ridership side of the study. I'm going to hand it back to Nicole, who's going to talk about next steps.
Yeah, so next slide, please. And next slide, please. So, this study, it's clearly a starting point, and there are a number of actions that we anticipate as follow-ups and next steps. Certainly, additional review of the market assessment results by MARC and VRE staff, evaluation of existing resources and the ability to accommodate run-through service, additional technical analysis to address questions prompted by the market assessment. For example, assessing what kind of impact there could be to Metro Rail and other transit agencies, consideration of the construction schedule for existing funded projects within the corridor, and continued agency coordination. Several projects are currently underway that support run-through service, including the Virginia Rail Improvement Program and the Long Bridge Environmental Impact Statement. In response to the efforts by the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Maryland General Assembly passed a bill in the 2020 legislative session in a show of support for the run-through service concept. However, due to the fiscal impact of COVID-19, Governor Larry Hogan determined that it was not financially feasible at this time and ultimately vetoed it. Nonetheless, the legislation drew additional attention to this topic and this opportunity. I would like to take a moment and thank the members of the TAC for their contributions to this project. Carrie Snyder with MDOT, Randy Selleck and Catherine Youngblood with DRPT, Jeffrey Bennett with DDOT, Dan Goldfarb with NVTC, Tim Canan and Eric Randall with COG TPB, Sonali Sineji with VRE, and Kyle Nemhard with MDOT MTA. Finally, one way to understand the outcome and the influence of this project is to hear the perspectives of the two agencies most closely tied to it. Sonali Sineji, VRE's Planning Program Administrator, and Kyle Nemhard, MTA Regional Planner and Project Manager, have agreed to deliver some closing remarks. Sonali, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nicole. On behalf of the Virginia Railway Express, I would like to thank the Transportation Planning Board for conducting the study and highlighting the potential of future MARC VRE run-through service. The study has shown that there is a latent demand for such service at existing destination stations, and that the service could encourage more mixed-use development in some emerging markets. It seems clear that run-through service would connect more jobs and housing by a one-seat ride, while expanding capacity and supporting resiliency of the existing regional transportation network. Operationally, a major benefit of running commuter trains beyond Union Station would be to relieve platform crowding and train storage constraints there, which could support the expansion of commuter rail and Amtrak service. To capitalize on these benefits, we will need to work together to address the challenges of implementing this service. VRE has not made any decision one way or another based on the study. We plan to incorporate additional analysis of run-through service in our long-range planning. The feasibility of such service would be evaluated in the context of future expansion of the overall VRE system. With that, I'll pass it over to Kyle Nemhart of Mark MTA for his comments.
Thank you, Sonali. As you heard from the presenters, collaboration began on this well before the Amazon HQ2 announcement, the LPA announcement for the Long Bridge, and recently the Commonwealth of Virginia's announcement with its deal with CSX. We definitely want to thank Nicole McCall, Tim Canan, and MWCOG staff for stepping up and offering a technical assistance program as a vehicle to assess the market potential for run-through. This effort was a great example of how MWCOG can facilitate collaboration on a subject involving multiple stakeholders in the region. We'd also like to thank the Technical Advisory Committee members for their participation in the market assessment. And we also like to thank the TPB Tech Committee who provided input at the previous meeting, and of course the input to be provided by the Transportation Planning Board. This market assessment is just the first step, and MDOT-MTA will consider the results of this analysis when evaluating its resources and operational practices as part of its general planning efforts. Studies like the MWCOG Mark VRE run-through market assessment will assist MTA in its practice of making data-driven decisions. Thank you for the opportunity to share this perspective, Madam Chair.
Thanks to all of you for all of the work that you've done on this. This is very exciting. So I will very quickly, since we're over time, I'm just going to ask if there's any urgent questions. I'll open up the floor to DC, Maryland, Virginia, WMATA, and other federal agencies. Okay, great. And again, if you have questions, you can go ahead and forward them through email. Appreciate your time very much and your patience. Thank you all for attending today. Our next meeting is scheduled for June 17th. I hope you remembered that Friday was Bike to Work Day and that you continue to celebrate it by biking anywhere, any day. And also this Memorial Day weekend, take a moment to remember those who gave all in service to others. Thank you. We'll see you next month.